Hey folks, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire to help others accomplish their own primitive building and hunting goals. Thanks for joining us today on an episode of Secrets in Science Chapters, where we go through and break down individual chapters from the Secrets in Science collection of books. Alright, today's chapter in the Secrets in Science here at Primitive Archery, Secrets in Science Chapters, we're going to talk about small points, little bird points here. To give an example, we'll refer back to this here again in a few minutes. This is a display case full of real artifacts. These are genuine arrowhead size, very small points people call bird points. Understanding these will give a lot more context to a lot of the other information in the book. And we've talked about it probably in some of the other episodes, Secrets in Science chapters, that this book really ties together all the other chapters. So like the reason for this chapter, you're going to learn more in the next chapter, and then that chapter is going to lead into the next chapter. And it's not just a whole bunch of random topics. It's it's not so much in chronological order, but it is going to tie a lot of the pieces together. And you'll see many times in the book where I say, refer back to such and such chapter on page whatever, and that way we're tying that whole bundle together. So there's a lot of chapters in this book regarding small points and the need to shoot smaller projectiles. And so I'm going to go through the table of contents, and at least I will mention some of the chapters, then we're going to go into some of those, and then we'll get into our bigger conversation. And it is a very big topic, so that's why it's going to take a little bit of time to really cover it without specifically going through each individual chapter. Okay, so we're going to talk at some point about the static friction test, and that's just simply a test that we did just showing the friction between different size and shape points. That's going to be a really good one. Also, we compare the Dr. Ashby reports to primitive contacts. So Dr. Ashby reports, a lot of people are really big into, very heavy arrows, high FOC, front of center, weight and balance, and that promotes a lot of penetration, and that doesn't really apply to primitive archery. So we'll be sure to cover some of that as well. Also, we will briefly talk about impacting ribs, okay, and then the puzzle pieces of small arrowheads, which starts on page 222, and that's probably where we're going to pick this up, and then hunting with small points shortly after that. Then that runs into small game birds and turkeys. So there's a whole bunch of different chapters, so we're going to bounce around and try to give you the cliff notes of all these different chapters, but there's so much good information in here that all ties together. If you don't have a book, I really recommend getting one. You can get it on PDF for pretty cheap too, especially if you're international, but you can order them at huntprimitive.com. But this right here is going to teach you everything you need to know about primitive building and hunting, using it in contextual hunting. So now, even before we talk about the small points, one of the other things that ties this together is another chapter up here called Primitive versus Modern Bowstrings. Now, we're not going to specifically dive into that chapter today, but I will mention that when you're shooting wood bows and contextual natural material bowstrings, meaning you go out into the woods and collect materials to make bowstrings, whether it's sinew, rawhide, or various plant fibers, you're going to notice that compared, especially as shown in that chapter, compared to modern bowstrings, the primitive natural material bowstrings do not perform as well. And you'll even see in the book that there's sometimes a 20 to 30 feet per second difference in shooting, say, a fast flight string versus a primitive natural material string. And so if we refer back to some of that which we talked about in previous episodes, which is the answers page, which is just on page 6, I give specific feet per second and energy requirements to successfully and repeatedly hunt with stone projectiles. And so in that, let's just say right off the cuff, let's say it's 25 foot-pounds of energy. When you do the math on that, what you're going to find is that you might have a bow that's shooting say 160 feet per second with a modern bowstring. Then you go and put natural materials bowstring on it, and you're going to drop down to maybe, let's say, 140, maybe even in 130s feet per second, and that could take you out of the threshold for being able to efficiently hunt with stone projectiles, especially if they're the more modern versions of stone arrowheads where people are making them much bigger. So again, there is a ton of information that we could cover in here, but that is really important that at least we lead off with that remember, natural material bowstrings in wooden bows are going to perform at a much lower level than the modern components that a lot of times people are utilizing in their primitive bow builds. So a guy goes out and buys a new modern made Osage bow. It's got reflex tips, a D97 fast flight string on it, and he's got everything really dialed in. He might be shooting 160, 170, 180, maybe 190 feet per second with that bow, and you can get away with shooting those larger points. But as you start really shooting contextual primitive hunting equipment with all natural materials, you're going to notice that the performance is going to be significantly less, even if you really bump the weight up. You could be shooting a 70-pound bow and still shoot significantly slower than, say, a 50-pound bow with all the modern bells and whistles. So that's going to lead into why these small points are so important, especially for early people in true primitive context. So it's definitely a complicated subject, without a doubt. So when we roll down into, we'll start, I guess, kind of right at the top in order of these chapters and where we start discussing this, and that would be the Dr. Ashby reports and primitive context. And to summarize this chapter, the Dr. Ashby reports, most people are familiar with them, shooting a very heavy arrow that penetrates better. So if you've got more mass in an arrow, then you're looking at having greater momentum and greater kinetic energy. It compounds faster than just simply shooting a light arrow faster and faster. So you get that compounding energy by shooting a very heavy arrow. And while that's true, what people are typically doing nowadays is they're putting really heavy metal broadheads on the end of their arrows, or they're weighting up the fronts of their carbon or aluminum shafts or whatever they're shooting. So they're getting that really high FOC, and they're getting a lot more mass in their arrow to try to get a lot of penetration. Now there's a ton of stuff to watch on YouTube about that, and there's some people that are kind of even, not necessarily debunking it, but showing that they're even taking a compound bow and they're shooting the same arrow off, the same bow, but they're shooting two different weighted arrows and they're getting the same penetration into a target. And honestly, once you've shot through an animal anyway, it doesn't really matter. You're only talking about hunting really big animals. But again, that does matter when you're shooting contextual stuff and your performance levels are way down. Okay, so the reason that it doesn't work with contextual primitive hunting equipment is that stone points have significantly more friction. So one of the things that's not really considered in the Dr. Ashby reports is friction, and that's a whole nother variable. But there's very little friction on a steel broadhead compared to a stone point, and that we did in the static friction test, and I'll explain that here in a moment. But to continue with the Ashby reports versus primitive context, the larger your stone point, the more friction it's going to have, and it's going to be much harder to penetrate. And also, steel is much heavier than stone. So to have, say, like 190 grain steel point, that's, still within normal broadhead dimensions. But if to have 190 grain stone point, now that thing's getting really big, and people will say, well, that's great, I want a really big point. They think about that when it comes to bison hunting or something, saying, well, if I'm going to hunt a moose or a bison, I'm going to need a really big point. And actually it's the opposite, because you're not even going to be able to penetrate with it. Those really large points have a tremendous amount of friction, and especially contextual primitive bows really struggle to penetrate with them. So when we decrease that friction by shooting a much smaller point and a very smooth and sleek tapered shaft or foreshaft that goes down into a nice smooth transition into that stone point, we can have the minimal amount of friction and still retain as much energy as needed to penetrate. And so the important thing to take away from that chapter is that the benefits of increased mass and kinetic energy from a large heavy projectile are outweighed by the negative effects of friction. So all the gains that you are gaining from having a larger and heavier stone point on the end of your arrow is completely negated and goes the opposite direction by the amount of friction it has. So the effects of friction are greater than the benefits of the added kinetic energy and momentum. And so that we without a doubt prove that over and over and over again. Like I said, I've been shooting a whole bunch of animals with stone points. I've killed a lot of them, more than probably about anybody else at this point in modern times. So we have a lot of data to back it up, and the data's in the book too. Anyway, we move into the static friction test, and that's on page 199, and I may go ahead and run into it and at least show you a couple pictures here. But what we did, we gained a lot of data here where you can actually look at it for yourself. So it's not just a breakdown on it, but it's actually giving the data. And what we did was I set up a jig to where we could have stone points, let's say on a shaft that I could put into a jig that we have weight, and we could stack weight on it manually. And I would literally stack it by 2 ounces at a time, and that weight was forcing straight down onto a fresh piece of green deer hide stretched over foam, so it didn't crunch up. We tried ballistics gel, but it's so small that all it did was squish it out. Without that whole rigidity of the animal's body, the ballistics gel doesn't really work. So we ended up having to switch over to foam, but really it had nothing to do with penetration through the foam, as you'll read in here, because as soon as it goes through the hide, it just sinks all the way through the foam. Getting through the hide was the toughest part. So we would be able to replace these basically foreshafts with different sizes and different shaped points on them, including steel and stone, and we were able to add weight and see how long until it punched through the deer hide and then down through the foam target. And that was really enlightening, and I will at least read a little bit of the data. Okay, so now a small stone point on a skinny tapered foreshaft, which is going to look like this. Very small. This is thinner than a pencil with a very small, not even really as wide as my finger. Okay, that size stone point on the static friction test took 62 pounds and 2.6 ounces to push through the deer hide. Now remember, that is not equal to saying, well, this is how much kinetic energy that I need to punch through this animal. It's not like that. Remember, this is a static friction test. It's not accounting for motion at all. All this is an apples to apples comparison. So these numbers, they are not equivalent to this is how much foot-pounds it takes, okay? So anyway, 62 pounds for this small point. We had 62 pounds of weight sitting on top of this in a jig, pushing straight down on deer hide, sitting on a polystyrene target. 62 pounds just to slide this little guy through. Okay? Now, on a steel point, so this was a steel broadhead, 125 grains, and you know how sleek and sharp those are? That only took 31 pounds. So half of the weight to sink a steel point that's wider than this, and on a thicker shaft, half the weight, because there's so much less friction. Very important point here. There's so much less friction on a steel point than even a little tiny stone point. Okay? Now, once we started getting into a medium-sized stone point, which is like this right here. Okay, now these are my standard hunting points. This is what most people now are shooting. They're not shooting the really small ones. We kind of bump up performance in different ways, and even with sinew strings and whatnot, I'm still shooting these. Shooting, you know, my favorite weight range on this stuff, honestly, is about 60 to 80 grains maximum. I don't go over 80 grains really ever anymore, and to me 80 grains is still pretty big. But on a medium size stone point, such as that, it took 75 pounds of weight to shove through. So we had 62 on the little one, 75. So still a significant increase. Now we had an extra large stone point. This was 1.5 inches wide by 2 3/4 inches long, and it was 175 grains. So it's much larger than recommended. And that one took 82 pounds to force through. So the difference between the 75 and the 82 is not severe, but when you really back it off to say like the 60, 62, and then up to actually the 70. Oh no, I read that wrong. We need to go back here. So the medium size, we tested the haft as well. The medium size point only took 63 pounds to push through. Very similar to the small one that took 62. So that there wasn't a huge jump there. When it jumped to 75 was when the hafting transition was not smooth and optimized. So we put a medium-sized point on the foreshaft, but we did not smooth and optimize the hafting transition, and that's when we jumped from 63 to 75. So it took that much more energy just to get past a poorly hafted transition, an abrupt transition. Okay, now we'll go ahead back to the extra large stone point, 175 grains, much wider, 1.5 inches wide, 2 3/4 inches long. That took 82 pounds, and that's on a good transition. That's as smooth of a transition as we can get. So you're talking not quite double, obviously. Well, definitely not double, but over double or at double between the metal point and the small and the medium, and then bumping up another 20 pounds, another 20 pounds of weight before we could send that big point through. And then we've got another one here. There's a few other tests in here, but we have another one that's approximately 90 grains stone point, but it's got a rounded front as shown in the picture. And I'll show you this. Bring it up here so you can see it. So you can see this one here. This is our normal size hunting point. You can see how nice and sharp that is, comes steep, and a lot of people are hunting with stuff like this, and see how round it is, and it's kind of clunky. When we tested that point, we put 108 pounds on top of that clunky point to try to shove it through that deer hide, and it never made it through the foreshaft and the stone point where they met. That whole thing buckled and broke to failure. So at 108 pounds, sitting right on top of a little arrow shaft straight down, broke, and it didn't penetrate. And that is really important, as you'll even read in the book, because a lot of people that have hunted with those big clunky points have reported back that they have bounced off of deer. I don't mean just like, hit them and they kind of stuck a little bit. I mean they shoot them and the arrow comes back. I've done that personally twice. I have bounced 2 arrows off deer when I was first getting started, and my buddy Joe McConnell, same thing. He's got a very similar story, as do many other people. They shoot a big clunky stone point thinking, oh, well, this should work because this is an artifact, but it's not an artifact for an arrowhead. It's either an atlatl head or it's an exhausted knife, but it's clunky and it's not meant to penetrate with a light arrow, and they actually bounce off the deer like a trampoline. They bounce back to you. So that information in here shows in this static friction test just the difference between a steel point that only takes 31 pounds of pressure to sink right through, and then 62 pounds and 63 pounds on our smaller stone points, and then a crappy transition goes to 75 pounds that it takes, and then a large stone point takes 82, and a medium-sized clunky stone point basically to failure, 108 pounds. And but also, if we back up to that extra large stone point that took 82 pounds, that is again why some people that are shooting those modern components, a fast flight string, they can take a larger point and still get penetration, sufficient penetration to kill the animal. But if they would take that same modern setup and back it down to say like a 60, 70 grain stone point, they're going to get even more penetration. So that would be important if you were actually going to hunt something very large, say like bison or moose. So you actually want to decrease the size of the point, decrease the friction to get maximum penetration. Okay, the next chapter is the hafting chapter, which we're not going to specifically go through. In this one, I've got a great video on hafting stone points, and I do a complete walkthrough on it. So what I'll do is I'll throw the thumbnail up on the screen so you guys can at least see what that video looks like. You can find it on the Hunt Primitive YouTube channel. Just type in Hunt Primitive how to haft stone points, or you can go to huntprimitive.com. I'll go ahead and I'll make sure that that one is in my blog, Secrets and Science Chapters video blog on the website as well, so you can find it there. But we're not going to discuss it, but we did briefly discuss it in the static friction test, where a poorly hafted stone point has significantly more friction, which is going to decrease penetration. Okay, so now we're going to move on. We're going to briefly discuss impacting ribs. Okay, so this actually just recently was brought up on the internet, so it's a perfect time to even talk about that. Just saying, well, you know, these little points are never going to have enough. They're too brittle. You know, when you hit if you hit something like a bison rib, they're just going to blow up or break. They're not going to go through. And it's important to remember that all stone points and the hafting transition are the weak link in every Stone Age arrow, especially the hafting joint, but the stone points as well, because they are somewhat brittle. So it doesn't matter what you hit a big robust bone with, whether it's a big point or a small point, they're all going to break and they're all going to fail. It's actually fairly rare to hit a bison rib square on, but if you do, it stops. I've seen it happen a couple times. It will not go through on a big bison. Now a younger bison, you know, or a juvenile, like a cow, like a younger cow per se, not just necessarily really small ones, but like a younger cow, still a little smaller, softer ribs, you can break through those ribs. That works. We've cut through some of those ribs. But typically, if you hit a big, robust bull bison on the ribs, it's not going to penetrate with any stone point. And most steel points, honestly, are not going to go through either. Now, when it comes to deer ribs or hog ribs, I've never had a problem. I shoot right through them all the time. I can spine shoot hogs. I've done it many times where I've spine shot a hog with a little piece like this. It slides right in there and it drops them, you know, and then you run up and finish them off. The bigger stone points as well. Typically the stone point's mangled, but you get them. But ribs are not a concern on deer or hog or bear-sized game. Maybe some big bears you might have an issue with. Elk, 50-50. You know what I mean? Big bull elk, you might have an issue. Cows, not really. So impacting ribs really isn't that big of a deal, but we also have to remember that when you're shooting a small point, statistically, you are actually have a less of a chance of hitting a rib with a small point than you do a big point. So you have just less surface area in general. But if you hit one square on, it doesn't matter what you hit it with. So it's not, you don't just kick rocks and say, oh, shucks, and go home. And you shoot it again. So that's just the nature of primitive hunting. You don't just say, oh, well, I didn't get that one, so, you know, I shot it and it didn't go through the rib, so we're just not going to eat today. It's like you go shoot another one. Shoot the same one, shoot another one, go get the job done. You know, that's just the nature of primitive hunting. And like I said, it doesn't matter what you shoot it with. So shooting big animals with these little points is a lot more efficient than you think it is. Okay, so then the chapter that discusses the puzzle pieces of small arrowheads, that is an interesting one because it really does tie a lot of it together of what we've discussed already. And so actually I just went right by the shape of notches, and I want to show you this one real quick because this is going to stop penetration as well. That's just a very simple picture. You can see the one here, that is what we're looking for. No trailing edges that stick out. One like this is okay as well. This is a problem. See, when you start having protruding pieces coming off, those are going to hang up and slow your penetration significantly as well. I just wanted to at least point that out. That goes along with transition stuff. It needs to be very, very smooth. So let's just go ahead and read through a little bit of this chapter here, and then we don't need to dwell on it too much, but it should sum up some of what we've talked about, which is true arrowheads found in the archaeological record are notoriously small. These are common throughout the continent going back to approximately 1500 years. Some of these points have notches, but many do not. So that'd be like the Madison or the Mississippi triangles kind of stuff. Fresno's, well, similar to those, they've got little notches on them, I guess. But some of them have little notches and some don't. These are also associated with big game kills, such as bison. Today's hunting standards typically utilize very large and heavy metal broadheads. That is highlighted well in the chapter on resistance testing, which is the static friction test. Smooth, sharp metal points penetrate animals much easier than stone. We showed that. Half as much weight as it took to penetrate. That allows for the use of larger points to promote larger wound channels and easier tuning of flight characteristics with heavier FOC balancing. These larger metal points work exceptionally well with modern bows and modern strings. If we implement in the same standards of the build with a contextual wooden bow and natural string materials and stone projectiles, we begin to run into some problems. And so that's whole chapter is going to really sum up a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this one, and it's probably going to make some other points that I didn't already make. Now, we tested down to about, here's a great little difference here you can see in the size between a little stone point, more of a contextual stone point, versus what a lot of folks are hunting with, and they're really not getting enough penetration with those big points. So now we have a chapter called Hunting with Stone Points. Now this one is a really good chapter, and there's a ton of data, so we don't even necessarily need to go through it. This is the proof in the pudding right here. Okay, so that's a little tiny point. That's a hog that I shot, but what you're going to see is data sheets like this. And we've got pages, okay? Pages of data sheets showing where we hit the animal, okay? All the information about it, the size of the point, what it was made out of, the dimensions, the weight, the feet per second that the bow was shooting, all of the information that a guy would need to be able to do it. And it's little notes, blood trail notes or penetration notes, but we have all of these. Me and my friend Vastin went out and just hunted hogs, especially him. A tremendous amount of wild hogs that we shot, all spot and stock, all from the ground, and collected data on. Okay, so that really pulls together, showing how effective these little points are. We got great penetration with them, and they brought animals down very quickly. And then also at the back of the book that you'll see that we did pretty, like, relatively small points and killed the bison that is on the cover, again with pretty small stone points. And there's some more bison notes in there as well. Okay, so then the last thing that we're really going to talk about here is small game. So a lot of people, they look at a point like this and say, well, that's perfect for hunting, you know, maybe deer or whatever. They'll look at these small little points and they'll say, you know what, these probably were not used for hunting big game. They're probably for shooting rabbits. They call them bird points, so you're going to shoot birds with them. And that actually doesn't make nearly as much sense, because I would rather shoot a large point. If I was going to shoot a stone point, I would rather shoot a large point at a small game animal, because it doesn't take nearly as much to penetrate them, but you're going to get a much bigger laceration, chance of hitting something vital on a very small animal. But I don't hardly ever shoot stone points at small game. When it comes to hunting rabbits or squirrels, I always shoot blunt tipped arrows. So they're just, and they don't have I've tried them with antler and all that stuff, but I just take my normal cane arrow, and it just has, I have the end filled, just plugged with a piece of hardwood or more skewers of cane or whatever, but it is just cut square off, and it is just blunt, and I kill a lot of rabbits. There's no need to shoot small game with stone points. I'm not saying that they never did, because what they probably had was just a bunch of arrows with the little tiny arrowheads on them, and they probably shot everything with them. But if they were shooting a heavier bow, similar to me, I have no issue killing rabbits and birds with just blunts. They're devastating. So when you're shooting those heavier bows, those blunts are just so devastating. I would never even want to shoot a stone point because it takes too long to make them and haft them, put them on, and then you just shoot them through small game or into the ground and break them or lose them. What a pain in the butt that is. That's why I always shoot blunts, because you can just shoot them over and over and over and over and over. And you kill a lot of animals with the same exact blunt. So totally unnecessary to shoot small game with those little points. Now, it has been brought up that perhaps some are blowgun points, and I would say the really small ones are possible that those are blowgun points. I do not have a tremendous amount of experience with a blowgun. I've made them and I've used them and I'm not impressed. And I know people always say, would you build a blowgun and go hunt with it? And every time that I start monkeying with it, I say, why am I going to mess with this when I'm carrying a bow and arrow? I can't go kill a deer with a primitive contextual blowgun, not unless you have poison. Okay, and even then, that's fairly questionable, not to mention illegal here in America. But sure, the modern ones with steel points and all of that, that's a different story. Obviously, people know, they've seen Tim Wells do it. You can kill some bigger animals with it. I know a lot of other people have tried and they haven't gone very good because of either small blood trails or the animal gets away or whatever. But using a real primitive contextual blowgun, to me, is not something I'm that interested in, because I'm already out hunting and I'm out to shoot hogs or deer, and then I can shoot the small game with blunts and all of that kind of stuff. So really, I just have no interest in shooting a blowgun, because if I'm not going to carry a blowgun and a bow and arrow around when I can just shoot small game with blunts and kill them that way. And I would say the contextual reasoning for shooting a blowgun might be more for something that kids can go hunt with, or maybe somebody that's older or injured or whatever. They're hunting small game around. I see some plausibilities to it. Me personally, if I'm bow hunting, I'm not messing with that. I'm out there, I got stuff. I can hit way better with a blunt, shooting it from my bow, than I can a blowgun, especially like a real primitive contextual blowgun. I think that covers it, and that's why, again, maybe some of these tiny little points, this one here is pretty small, might be something for a blowgun. But I look at that and I say, if I put it on a really thin foreshaft, I don't have a problem shooting stuff with that. We used really small points down to 12 grains. I think there might have been one even there in 8 grains, I don't remember, but very, very small. And we're shooting hogs with them and killing them pretty quick. So those little points don't offend me too much. But again, if I can get a bigger wound channel and I can shoot these 60 to 70, 80 grain stone points with minimal friction, penetration loss because of the friction, then I shoot these typically. But yeah, when you start getting into that bigger animal, that's when you're going to notice that you do have some decreased penetration, and shooting some of these small ones will work out for you. So I hope that we really explained this for you. I know it's a complicated subject. The book is really important to understanding this. It's going to cover so much more than I can even in this video. So if you're really interested in this subject, then I recommend picking up the book Secrets and Science of Archery. And there's 3 different ones. There's also Secrets and Science of the Atlatl and the Secrets and Science of Building Bows and Arrows, which just covers only the building, not the application. The first book, the first volume, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, is the one that has all the practical application stuff that we've talked about today. Hopefully it helped, and we'll catch you on the next one.